Welcome to your Term 2 tutorial on prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, so types of cells. I'm going to go ahead and write that across the top of my paper, prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, and you guys should go ahead and write that in your first little box for this set of notes for your quick review. The first thing that we're going to do before we start talking about what are different or what some differences are between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, because they're both types of cells, we want to quickly just talk about the cell theory. So we're going to start with that. So I'm going to write the cell theory over here in my box, and you can do the same thing on your paper. The cell theory is composed of 5 tenets, and you don't need to know them in order, you just need to know that all of them are true for all cells. The first thing is that all living things are composed of cells. And we can go ahead and write that. All living things are composed, which just means made up of cells. Easy peasy. The second part of the cell theory states that cells are the basic unit of structure and function. So cells are the basic unit of structure and function. The third part of the cell theory says that cells all contain DNA. The fourth part says that cells can only come from pre-existing cells. And then lastly, the last part of the cell theory states that metabolism happens in cells. And remember, metabolism is just a fancy word for chemical reactions. So now that we have the 5 tenets of the cell theory and we know that all of these things are true for all cells, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Now, there are a number of distinct differences between the two, but there are also some things that they have in common. For instance, obviously, they're both cell types, so they're both found in living things. But let's go ahead and talk about our prokaryotes first, because these guys are pretty simple in terms of what they contain and what they're found in. So prokaryotes, there's not a whole lot going on with these guys, so I'm going to write some information about them down here. So our prokaryotes, some key terms that you need to know about them. First thing, they are simple. So there's not a whole lot going on inside of them. The second thing is that they tend to be pretty small. And then another thing that's pretty important about these guys is that they have no nucleus. And on top of having no nucleus, we can also add that they have no membrane-bound organelles. That means that all of those organelles that you remember us talking about in class, like endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria and chloroplasts, none of these things are going to be found in prokaryotes because all of those things have membranes that surround them that allow them to be their own separate little rooms inside of this particular cell. The last thing that you need to know about prokaryotes is that there's only one living example of a prokaryote on this planet, and the only living example is going to be something called bacteria, and that's really important. So bacteria are the only examples of prokaryotes that you will see on the planet. You won't find any other type of prokaryote that exists. And because they're pretty simple, we can go ahead and draw out a picture so you can get a sense of what they actually look like. So I'm going to go ahead and draw out the outer portion of my cell. So here's my bacterial cell. And my bacterial cell has something on the outside called a cell wall, which we've talked about before. So we have a cell wall. Inside of that cell wall, we have something that's true for all cell types. It's a boundary that controls what can enter and exit and also maintains homeostasis. And this guy is called a cell membrane, found in all cells. And I'm going to go and highlight that so that you know that that thing is found in all cells. Now, outside of that, a prokaryote is pretty simple because the only other thing that we're really going to talk about in this guy is that there's going to be this loosey-goosey DNA. It's kind of like a ball of string on the inside. But notice that this DNA, I'm going to write loose DNA because it's not found inside of a nucleus, is in something called a nucleoid. Now there's one more or two other things that you need to know about this that's also found in some other types of cells. There are these little dots, which are the site of protein synthesis. And these little dots are called ribosomes. And the last thing that you need to know is that there's this liquid material that all of that stuff is floating in inside the cell, and that is called, and cytoplasm is found in all cells. So I'm going to go ahead and put a star next to that and a star next to ribosome. So we know that that's true for all cell types that we're going to talk about. So a bacterial cell is pretty simple. Cell wall, cell membrane, cytoplasm, some ribosomes, and then loose DNA floating in the middle. Not a whole lot else going on with that. And again, the only example of a prokaryote is going to be bacteria. Now let's jump to our eukaryotes. The important thing to remember is that you are a eukaryote. So think about what is unique about your cells. So these cells, instead of being simple, small, and not very complex, these guys tend to be larger. So they're going to be large. We're going to say that they're complex. And one of the defining characteristics is that they have a nucleus. So they have this brain that helps to control complex activity inside the cell. And then on top of that, we also have our membrane-bound organelles. Now I'm just going to go ahead and write some examples of these guys. So we're talking about things like ER, mitochondria, which we talked about in regards to cellular respiration. We have things like chloroplasts for photosynthesis. We have the Golgi, which we know is the post office of the cell. And then we also have things called lysosomes. So all of these things are examples of organelles that would be found in eukaryotes but would never be found in prokaryotes because prokaryotes are not complex enough to house those things. Now in a later tutorial, we're going to compare and contrast different types of eukaryotes comparing animals and plants, but for right now we're going to just talk about some basic differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. I do quickly want to emphasize one thing. It is important to note that when we talk about types of organisms that are eukaryotic, it's everything but bacteria. So that includes animals. Animals are included in this group. Plants are included in this group. Fungi are included in this group. And then finally, protists are included in this group. But if it's not an animal, plant, fungus, or a protist, meaning if it's a bacteria, then we know that it has to be a prokaryote. All right, now that we have that done, I want to go ahead and draw a Venn diagram because you're going to see this on your being able to compare and contrast prokaryotes to eukaryotes. So I'm going to draw my Venn diagram here. So here it is. Here's my big old circle. And here's my other big old circle. And I'm going to label the sides. Here's going to be my prokaryote. And here's going to be my eukaryote. So if we're comparing the two to one another, let's go ahead and see if we can populate the middle. So the first thing that I know that's true for both of these is that I know that these guys are both a type of cell, right? And if we look down here, I already told you that all of them contain cytoplasm, so that's one thing that can go in the middle. They all contain a cell membrane. We've talked about that before. It's in the picture down here, and they all contain ribosomes. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot that they have in common, so we're going to see different things. So if we're talking about our prokaryotic side, for our prokaryotes, we know that prokaryotes are going to be small, and they're also going to be simple. On the opposite side for our eukaryotes, these guys tend to be large and they're also going to be complex. Okay? We also have no nucleus present in prokaryotes, and we definitely have a nucleus in eukaryotes. We can also say that prokaryotes are only bacteria and eukaryotes are everything except bacteria. And then lastly, we can say no membrane-bound organelles. For our prokaryotes, and then for our eukaryotes, we can say that they definitely have membrane-bound organelles. All right, so those are all the big ticket items that you need to know comparing and contrasting prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. If you have any questions, let me know. And once you get this all copied down, go ahead and attempt those practice problems on your paper to get yourself ready for your Term 2 assessment. Thanks, guys.